On the bitter morning of November 8, 1859, the residents of Pine Creek Settlement in the Colorado Territory woke to discover something that would haunt their frontier community for generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The modest wooden cabin belonging to Margaret Hartford, known throughout the territory as the woman who had buried 7 husbands in less than 5 years, stood eerily silent with smoke no longer rising from its stone chimney. When concerned, neighbors finally broke down the reinforced oak door. They found the cabin completely empty except for 7 wedding rings arranged in a perfect circle on the kitchen table, each one bearing the initials of a different man. Margaret Hartford, the enigmatic woman who had arrived in Pine Creek as a young widow and somehow managed to outlive husband after husband in what locals had begun calling the most cursed string of marriages in the American West, had vanished without a trace. Left behind were only those 7 golden bands, a leather journal filled with entries written in a strange code that no one could decipher, and a mystery so profound that it would consume the lives of everyone who dared to investigate it. What the territorial authorities discovered during their search for Margaret Hartford would shake the foundations of frontier justice and reveal secrets so dangerous that 3 prominent families would spend fortunes trying to bury the truth forever. The woman they thought they knew, the quiet widow who seemed to attract tragedy like a magnet, had been something far more sinister than anyone in Pine Creek could have imagined. To understand how Margaret Hartford became the most feared woman in the Colorado Territory, we must journey back to the spring of 1854, when she first arrived in Pine Creek Settlement as Martha Jane Collins, a 22-year-old widow from Missouri, whose husband had supposedly died of consumption during their westward journey. The Colorado Territory in 1854 was a place where people came to reinvent themselves, where questions about the past were considered impolite, and where a woman alone was both vulnerable and valuable in a land where men outnumbered women 10-1. Pine Creek Settlement sat nestled in a valley surrounded by snow-capped peaks, a community of roughly 300 souls who had come west seeking gold, land, or simply a chance to escape whatever they had left behind in the established states. The settlement consisted of a main street lined with false-fronted buildings housing a general store, a saloon called the Silver Dollar, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and a boarding house run by widow Emma Thompson, who would become one of the few women to survive knowing Margaret Hartford's true nature. The town had been founded 2 years earlier when prospector Daniel Mackenzie discovered a rich vein of silver in the nearby mountains. Unlike the chaotic boomtowns that sprouted like weeds throughout the territory, Pine Creek had attracted a more stable population of families, merchants, and farmers who saw opportunity in providing services to the miners rather than chasing fortune with pick and shovel. This civilized atmosphere made it the perfect hunting ground for someone with Margaret Hartford's particular talents. Martha Jane Collins, as she was known then, arrived on a supply wagon driven by trader Samuel Patterson, claiming that her husband had died of lung fever just 3 days outside of Pine Creek. She carried with her a small trunk of belongings, a modest sum of money, and a story that touched the hearts of everyone who heard it. She was young, beautiful in a quiet way, with auburn hair that caught the mountain sunlight and green eyes that seemed to hold depths of sadness that made men want to protect her. Her manner was soft-spoken and refined, suggesting an education and upbringing uncommon on the frontier. Emma Thompson immediately offered Martha Jane a room at her boarding house, and within a week, the young widow had become a fixture in Pine Creek society. She attended church services faithfully, helped with community events, and possessed a remarkable talent for cooking and sewing that quickly made her indispensable to the settlement's social fabric. But what truly set Martha Jane apart was her uncanny ability to comfort the sick and dying, a skill that would prove far more sinister than anyone realized at the time. The first husband came into Martha Jane's life just 6 weeks after her arrival. Thomas Bradley was a successful merchant who owned the general store and had been a widower for 2 years since his wife died in childbirth. Thomas was a kind man. In his early 30s, well respected in the community, and possessed of enough wealth to provide security for a young widow trying to make her way in a dangerous world. His courtship of Martha Jane was gentle and proper, conducted under the watchful eyes of the entire community, who approved heartily of the match. Their wedding took place on July 4, 1854, in the community church with nearly the entire settlement in attendance. Martha Jane wore a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself, and Thomas presented her with a gold wedding band that had been crafted by the town's blacksmith using gold dust from his own mining claims. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with fiddle music, dancing, and enough food and drink to satisfy everyone in Pine Creek. It seemed like the perfect beginning to a frontier marriage built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Thomas Bradley's death 6 months later shocked everyone in Pine Creek settlement. The previously healthy merchant began experiencing severe stomach pains in late December of 1854, symptoms that gradually worsened despite the ministrations of the traveling doctor who visited Pine Creek once a month. Martha Jane nursed her husband with devotion that impressed the entire community, sitting by his bedside day and night, preparing special meals to tempt his failing appetite, and administering the herbal remedies that she claimed to have learned from her late mother. Despite her tireless care, Thomas's condition continued to deteriorate. He suffered from violent nausea, intense abdominal pain, and a strange metallic taste in his mouth that he described to friends as being like copper pennies. Dr. Henry Walsh, the circuit physician who happened to be in town during Thomas's final week, was baffled by the symptoms and attributed the illness to some form of gastric fever, common in frontier settlements where sanitation was often poor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas Bradley died on January 15, 1855, after 5 days of agony that left him a shadow of his former self. His final words, spoken to his friend and business partner James Morrison, were a warning that would later take on chilling significance. Thomas claimed that his food had been tasting strange for weeks, with a bitter aftertaste that his wife assured him was caused by the iron content in their well water. He also mentioned that Martha Jane had been very particular about preparing all his meals herself, insisting that she wanted to care for him properly during his illness. The funeral was a somber affair attended by everyone in Pine Creek. Martha Jane, dressed in deep mourning black, wept openly at the graveside and seemed genuinely devastated by her loss. The community rallied around the young widow, offering support and comfort during her time of grief. Thomas had left his store and substantial savings to his wife, making her one of the wealthiest women in the territory, and an even more attractive prospect for the many single men who began paying court within what they considered a respectable period of mourning. The second husband entered Martha Jane's life with surprising speed. Robert Chun was a Chinese immigrant who had come to Colorado, seeking his fortune in the gold fields, but had instead found success as a skilled carpenter and builder. His relationship with Martha Jane raised eyebrows in the community, not because of any suspicion about her previous husband's death, but because marriages between white women and Chinese men were unusual and sometimes dangerous in the frontier territories where racial tensions ran high. Robert was a quiet, hard-working man who had earned respect in Pine Creek through his craftsmanship and honest dealing. He had built several of the settlement's most impressive structures, including the church steeple and the elaborate facade of the Silver Dollar Saloon. His courtship of Martha Jane was conducted with the same careful attention to detail that characterized his carpentry work, and their marriage in September of 1855 was a smaller affair than her first wedding, attended primarily by the more progressive members of the community. Robert Chun's death 7 months later followed a pattern that would become terrifyingly familiar to those who eventually pieced together Martha Jane's true nature. Like Thomas Bradley, Robert had been in perfect health until he began experiencing mysterious symptoms that Dr. Walsh diagnosed as another case of gastric fever. The illness followed the same progression: violent stomach pains, nausea, metallic taste, and gradual weakening until death claimed him in April of 1856. Martha Jane's grief appeared as genuine as it had been for Thomas, and once again, the community supported her through her mourning period. She inherited Robert's carpentry business and tools, along with the money he had saved from his building contracts. Combined with Thomas Bradley's inheritance, Martha Jane was now a woman of considerable means for the frontier, which only increased. The attention she received from prospective suitors. The third husband was William Davis, a rancher who owned a large spread about 10 miles outside of Pine Creek, where he raised cattle for the mining camps scattered throughout the region. William was a robust man in his late 20s, known for his strength and vitality, which made his death 9 months after marrying Martha Jane all the more shocking to the community. The same mysterious illness, the same devoted nursing from his wife, the same baffling symptoms that Dr. Walsh could neither understand nor treat effectively. By the time William Davis died in February of 1857, a few people in Pine Creek were beginning to whisper about the remarkable string of bad luck that seemed to follow Martha Jane Bradley Chun Davis, as she had become known. 3 healthy men had married her, and 3 healthy men had died within months of their weddings, all from the same mysterious gastric ailment that seemed to strike only husbands of the beautiful widow. Emma Thompson, the boarding housekeeper who had befriended Martha Jane when she first arrived in Pine Creek, was among the first to voice concerns about the pattern of deaths. Emma had lived through enough frontier hardships to develop a healthy skepticism about coincidences, and the deaths of 3 husbands in less than 3 years struck her as statistically impossible. Her attempts to discuss her suspicions with other community members were met with resistance from people who had grown genuinely fond of Martha Jane and couldn't believe that such a devoted wife could be capable of harming her husbands. The 4th husband was Frank Mueller, a German immigrant who operated a successful brewery that supplied beer to saloons throughout the territory. Frank was a jovial man with a loud laugh and an enormous appetite for life, which made his marriage to the quiet widow seem like an unlikely match. Their wedding in June of 1857 was a boisterous celebration that reflected Frank's personality, with enough beer and sausages to feed the entire settlement and dancing that continued until dawn. Frank Mueller lasted longer than Martha Jane's previous husbands, surviving almost a full year of marriage before the familiar symptoms began to appear. His death in May of 1858 was particularly tragic because he had been planning to expand his brewery and had spoken excitedly about starting a family with Martha Jane. Like her previous husbands, Frank left everything to his wife, adding a profitable business and substantial savings to her growing fortune. The 5th husband was David Porter, a former cavalry officer who had come west after being wounded in conflicts with Native American tribes. David was a careful, observant man whose military training had taught him to notice details that others might miss. His courtship of Martha Jane was longer and more cautious than her previous relationships, and several people noted that he seemed to be studying her as much as romancing her. David Porter's death in December of 1858 followed the same pattern as his predecessors, but with one crucial difference. Before he died, David managed to share his suspicions with his friend and fellow veteran, Captain James Sullivan, who commanded the small military detachment stationed near Pine Creek. David told Sullivan that he had been keeping a journal of his symptoms, and that he suspected his wife was slowly poisoning him with something that created the gastric distress that had killed her previous husbands. Unfortunately, David Porter died before he could provide any concrete evidence of his suspicions, and his journal disappeared from his personal effects before Captain Sullivan could examine it. Martha Jane claimed that her husband had become delirious in his final days and had imagined threats that didn't exist, an explanation that Dr. Walsh supported based on his observation of similar confusion in other patients suffering from severe gastric ailments. The sixth husband was Peter Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who owned a successful freight business that transported goods between Denver and the smaller settlements scattered throughout the territory. Peter was known for his shrewd business sense and his ability to read people, skills that had served him well in the often dangerous business of frontier transportation. His marriage to Martha Jane in March of 1859 raised the eyebrows of those who wondered why such a smart businessman would risk becoming her seventh widowed husband. Peter Kowalski's death in August of 1859 was the most public of Martha Jane's husband's deaths because it occurred during the annual Founders' Day celebration, when much of the territory's population had gathered in Pine Creek for the festivities. Peter became violently ill during the community barbecue, suffering convulsions and severe pain while hundreds of witnesses watched in horror. Dr. Walsh, who was present for the celebration, was able to observe the symptoms firsthand and for the first time began to suspect that something more sinister than gastric fever might be responsible for the string of deaths. The seventh and final husband was Michael O'Reilly, an Irish immigrant who had struck it rich in the silver mines and was known throughout the territory for his generosity and quick temper. Michael's courtship of Martha Jane was brief and passionate, and their wedding in September of 1859 was a grand affair funded by his mining wealth. Michael had publicly declared that he didn't believe the rumors about Martha Jane's previous husbands, claiming that any man brave enough to marry her would be lucky to have such a devoted wife. Michael O'Reilly's confidence proved to be tragically misplaced. He began showing symptoms of the familiar illness just 3 weeks after their wedding, and despite Dr. Walsh's more aggressive treatment based on his growing suspicions, Michael died in agony on November 5, 1859. His death was witnessed by several community members who had been keeping watch over the O'Reilly cabin, and their testimonies would later prove crucial in unraveling the mystery of Martha Jane's methods. The disappearance of Martha Jane Hartford, as she was now known, 3 days after Michael O'Reilly's death, finally convinced the authorities that Pine Creek settlement had been harboring one of the most prolific killers in American frontier history. The 7 wedding rings arranged on her kitchen table were more than just abandoned jewelry. They were trophies from a killing spree that had lasted 5 years and claimed the lives of 7 good men who had made the fatal mistake of falling in love with a beautiful woman whose heart was as cold as the Colorado mountains that surrounded their doomed community. The first official investigation into the disappearance of Margaret Hartford began when Territorial Marshal William Thompson arrived in Pine Creek Settlement on November 12, 1859. Thompson was a seasoned lawman who had spent 15 years tracking criminals across the frontier territories, and he possessed the kind of methodical mind that frontier justice desperately needed. Unlike the local sheriff, who had been content to accept the string of deaths as tragic coincidences, Thompson immediately recognized the pattern that suggested something far more sinister than bad luck. Marshal Thompson's investigation started with the 7 wedding rings that had been left behind in Margaret's cabin. Each ring bore distinctive craftsmanship that told the story of its owner's life and death. Thomas Bradley's ring was made from California gold with delicate engravings that spoke of prosperity and hope. Robert Chun's ring incorporated traditional Chinese symbols alongside Western designs, reflecting his dual heritage. William Davis had chosen a simple band crafted from silver mined in the local mountains. Frank Muller's ring was thick and robust, made from gold traded for his finest beer. David Porter's military precision showed in his ring's clean lines and martial engravings. Peter Kowalski's ring displayed the elaborate metalwork favored by Polish craftsmen. Michael O'Reilly's ring was the most expensive, studded with small diamonds that caught the light like tears. The arrangement of these rings in a perfect circle suggested deliberate symbolism rather than hasty abandonment. Thompson recognized that Margaret Hartford had not fled in panic, but had carefully staged her disappearance to send a message. The question that haunted him was whether the message was a confession, a challenge, or something even more disturbing. Each ring represented not just a marriage but a life deliberately ended, and their circular arrangement suggested a ritual completion that made Thompson's blood run cold. Dr. Henry Walsh became Thompson's most valuable ally in understanding the medical aspects of the case. Walsh had been troubled by the similarity of symptoms among Margaret's husbands for months, but his frontier medical training had not prepared him to recognize systematic poisoning. Working with Thompson, Walsh began to piece together the progression of each illness, noting the consistent timeline from first symptoms to death and the peculiar metallic taste that several victims had mentioned. The breakthrough came when Walsh remembered treating a poisoning case in Denver 2 years earlier. A mine foreman had accidentally ingested arsenic-contaminated water and had exhibited symptoms remarkably similar to those suffered by Margaret's husbands. Walsh's suspicion was confirmed when Thompson arranged for samples of soil from each husband's grave to be tested by a chemist in Denver. The results were damning. Every grave contained levels of arsenic that could only have resulted from systematic poisoning over extended periods. Captain James Sullivan, the military officer who had befriended David Porter, provided crucial insight into Margaret's methods. According to Sullivan, Porter had confided that his wife was extremely controlling about food preparation, insisting on cooking every meal personally and becoming agitated when Porter suggested eating at the community gatherings or trying food prepared by others. Porter had found this behavior touching at first, interpreting it as wifely devotion, but had gradually become suspicious when he noticed that his symptoms worsened after meals that Margaret prepared with particular care. Emma Thompson, the boarding housekeeper who had housed Margaret when she first arrived in Pine Creek, emerged as a key witness whose observations would prove vital to understanding the killer's psychology. Emma had maintained a friendship with Margaret throughout her series of marriages, and her position as an older woman had allowed her to observe details that others had missed. Emma recalled that Margaret had been fascinated by stories of illness and death, often asking detailed questions about symptoms and treatments when community members fell sick. More disturbing was Emma's recollection of Margaret's library, which included several medical texts that seemed unusual for a frontier woman. Margaret had claimed that these books belonged to her deceased first husband, a story that Emma had accepted without question until Thompson's investigation revealed that Margaret's original husband had been a farm laborer with no medical training. The books, when examined by Dr. Walsh, contained detailed information about various poisons and their effects on the human body, with particular attention paid to substances that could simulate natural illnesses. The investigation revealed that Margaret had been far more calculating in her selection of victims than anyone had realized. Each husband had been chosen for specific qualities that made him an ideal target. Thomas Bradley's wealth and social standing had provided her with respectability and financial security. Robert Chun's isolated position as a Chinese immigrant had made his death less likely to attract scrutiny. William Davis's ranch had given her access to remote burial sites and explanations for his exposure to various toxins. Frank Muller's brewery had provided cover for the chemical odors that might have resulted from her poison preparation. David Porter's military background had represented a challenge that she had clearly relished. Peter Kowalski's transportation business had given her access to supplies from distant towns. Michael O'Reilly's wealth had been the final prize in her murderous accumulation of fortune. Thompson's investigation also uncovered evidence that Margaret had been preparing for her eventual disappearance long before Michael O'Reilly's death. Bank records from Denver showed that she had been gradually converting her inherited wealth into gold and silver coins that could be easily transported. She had also been corresponding with contacts in California under assumed names, apparently, arranging for new identity documents and safe passage to areas where her reputation was unknown. The Marshal's interviews with surviving community members revealed a pattern of manipulation that was breathtaking in its sophistication. Margaret had carefully cultivated relationships with influential women like Emma Thompson who could vouch for her character when suspicions arose. She had positioned herself as a devoted church member and community volunteer, creating a public image so positive that accusations against her seemed almost blasphemous. She had also been careful to vary the timing and circumstances of her husband's deaths enough to prevent easy pattern recognition while maintaining the consistent method that ensured success. Dr. Walsh's medical examination of the surviving evidence provided the scientific foundation for Thompson's criminal case. Analysis of preserved tissue samples from the most recent victims confirmed the presence of arsenic in quantities that would have caused excruciating death over the course of several weeks. The poison had been administered in gradually increasing doses, creating symptoms that mimicked natural gastric ailments while slowly destroying the victim's internal organs. The method required extensive knowledge of dosage and timing, suggesting either medical training or careful study of poisoning techniques. The investigation also revealed that Margaret had been experimenting with her methods throughout her murderous career. Thomas Bradley's death had been relatively quick, suggesting either a large dose or inexperience with proper timing. Later, victims had suffered longer, indicating that she had learned to extend their agony while maintaining the appearance of natural illness. This progression suggested a sadistic pleasure in the killing process that went beyond simple financial motivation. Thompson's search of Margaret's abandoned cabin uncovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards that contained her most damning secrets. Inside was a detailed journal written in a simple code that Dr. Walsh was able to decipher using his knowledge of medical terminology. The journal contained clinical observations of each husband's poisoning, including notes on dosage, symptoms, and the effectiveness of various administration methods. Most chilling were Margaret's personal reflections on her victims' suffering, which revealed a complete lack of empathy and a disturbing pleasure in their pain. The journal also contained detailed financial records showing how Margaret had systematically looted each husband's assets while he lay dying. She had transferred ownership of properties, liquidated investments, and even sold personal possessions, while her husbands were too sick to notice or protest. The methodical nature of this theft demonstrated that murder had been only part of her criminal enterprise. She had been operating what amounted to a serial killing business designed to accumulate maximum wealth through systematic elimination of wealthy husbands. Perhaps most disturbing was the journal's revelation that Margaret had been planning to expand her operations beyond Pine Creek settlement. She had researched other frontier communities where the male-to-female ratio would make her a valuable commodity and where law enforcement was weak enough to prevent effective investigation of suspicious deaths. Her disappearance had not been prompted by fear of discovery, but by satisfaction with her accumulation of wealth and readiness to begin the process again in a new location. The investigation faced significant obstacles due to the frontier justice system's limitations and the scattered nature of the evidence. Many potential witnesses had moved on to other settlements or had died from the various hazards of frontier life. Physical evidence was limited by the crude preservation methods available in 1859, and communication between different territorial jurisdictions was slow and unreliable. Thompson found himself trying to build a criminal case using methods that would not be fully developed for another generation. The manhunt for Margaret Hartford expanded beyond Colorado territory as Thompson coordinated with law enforcement agencies throughout the Western Territories. Telegraph messages carried her description to every major settlement from California to Kansas, but the vast distances and limited communication networks made tracking a single individual nearly impossible. Margaret had chosen her escape timing perfectly, disappearing just as winter weather was making travel difficult and pursuit dangerous. Local reaction to the investigation's revelations divided Pine Creek settlement along lines that reflected the community's complicated relationship with frontier justice. Some residents felt betrayed and demanded that Margaret be found and punished for her crimes. Others questioned whether the evidence was sufficient to justify the accusations against a woman who had been a respected community member. A few even suggested that the investigation was unfair to someone who could not defend herself against the charges. The case attracted attention from newspapers throughout the territory and beyond, making Margaret Hartford one of the first serial killers to achieve national notoriety. The combination of multiple murders, a beautiful female perpetrator, and the exotic frontier setting created a sensation that sold newspapers from New York to San Francisco. This publicity helped the investigation by encouraging witnesses to come forward, but it also made Margaret's capture more difficult by alerting her to the scope of the manhunt. As winter settled over the Colorado Territory, Marshall Thompson faced the grim reality that Margaret Hartford had successfully disappeared into the vast wilderness of the American West. The investigation had conclusively proved her guilt and revealed the horrifying scope of her crimes, but justice remained elusive. The 7 wedding rings on her kitchen table had become more than evidence. They were symbols of a frontier justice system's inability to protect the innocent from sophisticated predators who understood how to exploit the weaknesses of isolated communities. The search for Margaret Hartford would continue for months, following false leads and chasing shadows across the Western Territories. But even as the investigation expanded, Thompson knew that they were hunting someone who had demonstrated a remarkable ability to reinvent herself and disappear into new communities where her reputation was unknown. The question was not whether Margaret would kill again, but how many more husbands would die before frontier justice could finally catch up with the most dangerous woman in the American West. The spring of 1860 brought devastating news that would transform the Margaret Hartford investigation from a manhunt into something far more sinister. A telegram arrived at Marshall Thompson's office in Denver from Sheriff Augustus Bell in Sacramento, California, reporting the suspicious death of a wealthy merchant named Henry Caldwell, who had recently married a woman matching Margaret's description. The woman, calling herself Maria Collins, had disappeared immediately after her husband's funeral, leaving behind the same mysterious circumstances that had plagued Pine Creek settlement. Sheriff Bell's investigation revealed disturbing parallels to the Colorado murders that convinced Thompson they were dealing with a killer whose methods had evolved during her months on the run. Henry Caldwell had been a successful grain merchant who controlled several warehouses along the Sacramento River. His whirlwind courtship with Maria Collins had surprised his business associates, who noted that the reserved merchant had never shown interest in remarriage after losing his first wife to cholera 5 years earlier. The courtship had followed a pattern that was becoming terrifyingly familiar to investigators tracking Margaret's movements. Maria Collins had arrived in Sacramento claiming to be a widow from Oregon whose husband had died in a logging accident. She possessed enough knowledge of frontier life to make her story believable, and her refined manners and education had immediately set her apart from the typical women seeking husbands in the rough river town. Henry Caldwell had been completely captivated by her combination of vulnerability and sophistication. Their marriage had lasted exactly 4 months before Henry began experiencing the gastric distress that had killed 7 men in Colorado. Sacramento's physicians were initially puzzled by his symptoms, but Dr. Marcus Webb, who had trained in San Francisco's medical schools, recognized the signs of metallic poisoning when he examined the dying merchant. Webb's suspicions were confirmed when chemical analysis of Henry's hair and fingernails revealed arsenic levels that could only have resulted from deliberate administration over an extended period. The most chilling aspect of Henry Caldwell's Murder was the evidence that Margaret had refined her killing technique during her time as a fugitive. Where her Colorado victims had suffered for weeks before dying, Henry's poisoning had been administered with surgical precision that killed him quickly while maintaining the appearance of natural illness. The improvement in her method suggested that she had been practicing her deadly craft during the months between her disappearance from Pine Creek and her arrival in Sacramento. Dr. Webb's investigation also revealed that Maria Collins had been asking detailed questions about local banking practices and investment opportunities throughout her brief marriage. She had convinced Henry to liquidate several business investments and convert the proceeds to gold coins, claiming that she wanted to ensure their financial security in case economic conditions changed. The approximately $15,000 in gold that Henry had accumulated under his wife's guidance disappeared along with Maria Collins immediately after his death. The Sacramento investigation uncovered evidence that Margaret had established a sophisticated support network during her time as a fugitive. Bank records showed that she had been receiving funds from unknown sources, suggesting either accomplices or blackmail victims who were financing her criminal activities. More disturbing was the discovery that she had been corresponding with marriage brokers in several western cities, apparently shopping for her next victim while still married to Henry Caldwell. Marshal Thompson's journey to Sacramento to coordinate with Sheriff Bell revealed the true scope of Margaret's criminal enterprise. Working together, the two lawmen discovered that she had been using multiple identities and had established safe houses in at least 3 different states. The level of planning and resources required for such an operation indicated that Margaret's crimes went far beyond the opportunistic murders of lonely frontier husbands. The investigation in California also provided the first concrete evidence of Margaret's physical transformation during her time as a fugitive. Witnesses described Maria Collins as a blonde woman with blue eyes who spoke with a slight Southern accent, a dramatic change from the auburn-haired, green-eyed woman with Eastern mannerisms who had terrorized Pine Creek settlement. The sophistication of her disguise suggested either professional training or natural talent for deception that made her far more dangerous than a simple poisoner. Dr. Webb's examination of Henry Caldwell's personal effects revealed that Margaret had been studying her victim's business practices and social connections with the thoroughness of a professional spy. Hidden in Caldwell's desk were notes in Margaret's handwriting that detailed the financial status and personal habits of several other wealthy Sacramento merchants. The notes suggested that she had been planning to expand her operations within the Sacramento business community, possibly targeting multiple victims simultaneously. The discovery that Margaret had been scouting additional victims while murdering Henry Caldwell forced investigators to confront the possibility that they were dealing with something unprecedented in American criminal history. Previous serial killers had typically operated within limited geographical areas using consistent methods, but Margaret's crimes demonstrated a level of mobility and adaptability that made traditional law enforcement approaches ineffective. Sheriff Bell's investigation also uncovered evidence that Margaret had been blackmailing prominent Sacramento citizens who had secrets they wanted to keep hidden. Several wealthy merchants had made large cash payments to Maria Collins for what their financial records described as consulting services, but the timing and amounts suggested extortion rather than legitimate business transactions. This discovery indicated that Margaret was financing her criminal activities through multiple revenue streams, making her far more dangerous than a simple serial killer motivated by greed. The manhunt expanded dramatically when telegraph reports arrived from law enforcement agencies throughout the Western Territories describing similar cases of wealthy men dying under suspicious circumstances after marrying mysterious women who disappeared immediately after their husbands' deaths. Reports came from Oregon, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico, suggesting that Margaret's killing spree had spread across the entire American frontier during the months since her disappearance from Colorado. Each reported case showed evidence of The same methodical planning and execution that had characterized Margaret's crimes in Pine Creek Settlement and Sacramento. The victims were invariably wealthy, socially prominent men who had been targeted for their assets rather than chosen randomly. The murders were carried out using arsenic poisoning administered over periods ranging from weeks to months, depending on the victim's social connections and the killer's assessment of risk factors. Most disturbing was the pattern of escalation that emerged from analysis of the various crime scenes. Margaret's methods were becoming more sophisticated and her victim selection more ambitious with each murder. Where she had initially targeted isolated frontier merchants and ranchers, her more recent victims included prominent businessmen with extensive social networks and sophisticated security arrangements. The progression suggested that she was growing, more confident in her abilities and more willing to take risks for larger rewards. The investigation revealed that Margaret had been using her various identities to establish credit and business relationships that allowed her to move freely between different territorial jurisdictions. She had created a complex web of false documents, forged references, and purchased testimonials that made her virtually invisible to law enforcement agencies that lacked coordination and communication systems adequate to track such a sophisticated criminal. Dr. Webb's collaboration with physicians in other territories led to the development of what may have been the first criminal profile in American law enforcement history. Based on analysis of Margaret's victim selection, murder methods, and post-crime behavior, the doctors concluded that she was an exceptionally intelligent individual with extensive knowledge of chemistry, medicine, and business practices. Her ability to assume different identities and integrate herself into diverse communities suggested either formal education or extensive self-study that went far beyond typical frontier learning. The psychological aspects of Margaret's crimes also attracted attention from alienists and other early mental health professionals who were beginning to study criminal behavior from a scientific perspective. Dr. Nathan Pierce, of Philadelphia, physician who specialized in disorders of the mind, traveled to Sacramento to examine the evidence and interview witnesses. Pierce's analysis suggested that Margaret's crimes were motivated by something more complex than simple greed, possibly including a pathological need for control and dominance that manifested itself through the systematic destruction of her victims. The territorial governors of Colorado, California, Nevada, and Oregon met in an unprecedented conference to coordinate their response to what they recognized as a threat that transcended normal jurisdictional boundaries. The governors agreed to share information about suspicious deaths and to coordinate manhunt efforts, but the vast distances and limited communication systems of the frontier made effective cooperation nearly impossible. The financial impact of Margaret's crimes extended far beyond the direct theft of her victims' assets. Banks and investment houses throughout the Western Territories began requiring additional documentation for large transactions involving recently married couples, and insurance companies started investigating suspicious death claims more thoroughly. The economic disruption caused by these security measures may have cost the frontier economy more than Margaret's actual thefts. As the summer of 1860 progressed, Marshall Thompson faced the grim reality that Margaret Hartford had evolved from a local criminal into something resembling a one-woman crime syndicate operating across multiple territories. The traditional methods of frontier justice were proving inadequate to deal with a criminal who combined the mobility of a confidence artist, the scientific knowledge of a trained physician, and the ruthless efficiency of a professional assassin. The case took an unexpected turn when Thompson received a letter postmarked from San Francisco and signed with Margaret's real name. The letter, written in the same distinctive handwriting found in her Colorado journal, contained what appeared to be a confession to the murders, along with detailed descriptions of her methods and motivations. More disturbing than the confession itself was the tone of the letter, which suggested that Margaret viewed her crimes as a form of social experiment designed to expose the weaknesses of frontier society and its institutions. The letter also contained a challenge that would haunt Thompson for the rest of his career. Margaret wrote that she intended to continue her activities until law enforcement agencies developed the sophistication necessary to stop her, effectively using murder as a means of testing and improving the American justice system. The implications of this challenge were terrifying, suggesting that Margaret's crimes were motivated not just by greed, but by a desire to prove her intellectual superiority over the society that she was systematically victimizing. The investigation had revealed that Margaret Hartford was far more than a serial killer. She was a criminal innovator whose methods would influence law enforcement practices for generations to come. Her ability to operate across multiple jurisdictions using sophisticated disguises and false identities had exposed critical weaknesses in the American justice system that would require fundamental changes to address effectively. The hunt for Margaret Hartford had become a race between criminal innovation and law enforcement evolution, with the lives of wealthy men throughout the Western territories hanging in the balance. The breakthrough that would ultimately lead to Margaret Hartford's downfall came from an unexpected source in the autumn of 1860. Sister Catherine McKenna, a Catholic nun who operated a mission hospital in Santa Fe, New Mexico, sent a telegram to Marshal Thompson that would change the entire direction of the investigation. Sister Catherine reported that a woman matching Margaret's description had been volunteering at the hospital for several weeks, demonstrating an unusual knowledge of poisons and their antidotes while helping to treat patients suffering from various forms of accidental poisoning common in mining communities. Sister Catherine's suspicions had been aroused when the volunteer, who called herself Helen Morrison, had shown particular interest in cases involving arsenic poisoning from contaminated well water. Helen had asked detailed questions about symptoms, treatment protocols, and the length of time required for various dosages to prove fatal. When Sister Catherine discovered that Helen had been taking notes during these conversations and had requested access to the hospital's medical texts on toxicology, the nun's concerns had prompted her to contact territorial authorities. The timing of Helen Morrison's arrival in Santa Fe coincided perfectly with Margaret's disappearance from Sacramento, and her physical description matched the disguised appearance that witnesses had reported in California. More significantly, Helen had been asking questions around Santa Fe about wealthy unmarried men in the area, claiming that she was seeking employment as a housekeeper or companion for elderly gentlemen who needed domestic assistance. Marshal Thompson immediately departed for Santa Fe, traveling with a team of federal marshals who had been assigned to the case due to its multi-territorial nature. The journey across the dangerous terrain between Colorado and New Mexico took nearly 2 weeks, during which time Thompson wrestled with the possibility that Margaret might discover the investigation and disappear once again before they could apprehend her. Upon arriving in Santa Fe, Thompson worked closely with Captain Rodriguez of the Territorial Militia to establish surveillance of the mission hospital where Helen Morrison had been volunteering. The investigation team was careful to avoid direct contact with their suspect while gathering evidence that could definitively link Helen Morrison to Margaret Hartford's crimes in Colorado and California. Dr. Fernando Gutierrez, the chief physician at the mission hospital, provided crucial testimony about Helen Morrison's suspicious behavior during her time as a volunteer. According to Dr. Gutierrez, Helen had demonstrated knowledge of medical procedures and pharmacology that far exceeded what would be expected from someone claiming to be a simple frontier woman seeking charitable work. She had corrected his diagnosis on several occasions and had suggested treatment protocols that reflected advanced understanding of toxicology and internal medicine. Most damning was Dr. Gutierrez's discovery that several vials of arsenic compound had disappeared from the hospital's pharmacy during Helen's tenure as a volunteer. The missing poison had been stored in a locked cabinet that required detailed knowledge of the hospital's layout and procedures to access without detection. Helen Morrison was the only volunteer who had been given keys to the pharmacy area, and the thefts had occurred during shifts when she was working alone in the medical storage areas. The investigation also revealed that Helen Morrison had been cultivating relationships with several wealthy men in Santa Fe's merchant community. She had attended social gatherings at the local church and had been seen dining with prominent businessmen who were known to be seeking wives or female companionship. Her behavior followed the same pattern that had characterized Margaret's activities in Pine Creek Settlement and Sacramento, suggesting that she was already identifying and evaluating potential victims. Captain Rodriguez's surveillance team discovered that Helen Morrison was living in a boarding house under circumstances that suggested she possessed far more wealth than her claimed background would support. She occupied the establishment's most expensive room, ate elaborate meals, and wore clothing that reflected substantial financial resources. When questioned by the boarding house proprietor about her means of support, Helen had claimed to be receiving money from relatives in the East, but she had no mail forwarding arrangements and received no correspondence during her stay in Santa Fe. The surveillance operation faced significant challenges due to Santa Fe's compact size and Helen Morrison's apparent awareness that she might be under observation. She varied her daily routines unpredictably, used different routes when traveling around the town, and seemed to be constantly evaluating her surroundings for signs of surveillance. Her behavior suggested either paranoia or professional training in counter-surveillance techniques that exceeded what would be expected from a frontier serial killer. Dr. Gutierrez's cooperation with the investigation led to a plan designed to gather definitive proof of Helen Morrison's identity and criminal intentions. Working with Thompson and Captain Rodriguez, the doctor arranged for Helen to be given access to a patient who was supposedly suffering from mysterious poisoning symptoms that resembled those experienced by Margaret's previous victims. The patient was actually a federal marshal posing as a dying merchant, and his supposed illness was designed to test Helen's reaction to a situation that mirrored her previous crimes. Helen Morrison's response to the fake patient exceeded the investigators' worst expectations. She volunteered to provide special nursing care for the supposedly dying man, insisting that she had experience treating similar cases of gastric poisoning. More significantly, she offered to prepare special meals and medications that she claimed would ease his suffering, proposals that terrified the investigation team when they realized she was essentially volunteering to demonstrate her murder techniques on what she believed was a genuine victim. The plan to capture Helen Morrison in the act of attempting murder required careful coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies and medical personnel. Dr. Gutierrez arranged for the fake patient to be isolated in a private room where surveillance could be conducted without detection, while Thompson positioned federal marshals throughout the hospital to prevent Helen's escape if she became suspicious of the trap. The confrontation that would finally end Margaret Hartford's killing spree began when Helen Morrison arrived at the hospital carrying a small leather bag that contained what appeared to be medical supplies. She had told Dr. Gutierrez that she intended to administer a special treatment that would either cure the patient or ease his passage into death, a statement that revealed her complete confidence in her ability to control the timing and manner of her victims' deaths. Helen's behavior during the attempted murder demonstrated the clinical detachment that had enabled her to kill at least 8 men without apparent emotional distress. She examined the fake patient with professional thoroughness, asked detailed questions about his symptoms and medical history, and prepared her poison with the precision of a trained pharmacist. Her calm demeanor and methodical approach to what she believed was murder revealed the depth of her psychological pathology. The arrest of Helen Morrison as she prepared to administer arsenic to her intended victim provided the evidence that Thompson needed to conclusively link her to the Margaret Hartford murders. Chemical analysis of the substances in her leather bag revealed not only arsenic, but also several other poisons that suggested she had been experimenting with different murder methods during her time as a fugitive. More damning was the discovery of a detailed journal hidden in Helen's boarding house room that contained records of all her criminal activities since disappearing from Pine Creek settlement. The journal revealed that she had killed at least 12 men during her 18-month career as a fugitive, far more than investigators had suspected. The victims included not only the husband she had married, but also several men she had poisoned for their money without bothering to go through the formality of marriage. The journal also contained detailed plans for future murders, including target lists of wealthy men in various Western communities and strategies for establishing new identities when her current persona became too dangerous to maintain. The scope of her criminal planning revealed that Margaret Hartford had been operating what amounted to a systematic campaign of murder and theft that had generated enormous wealth while terrorizing communities throughout the frontier. Perhaps most chilling was the journal's revelation of Margaret's psychological state during her killing spree. Her entries revealed that she had come to view murder as a form of intellectual exercise, carefully analyzing each victim's personality and circumstances to determine the most efficient method of killing and theft. She wrote about her crimes with the detached tone of a scientist conducting experiments, showing no remorse for her victims or concern for the communities she had terrorized. The journal also contained evidence that Margaret had been studying law enforcement techniques and had been adapting her methods to stay ahead of the investigation. She had been monitoring newspaper coverage of her crimes and had modified her operations based on information published about the manhunt. Her ability to stay informed about law enforcement activities while maintaining her criminal operations demonstrated a level of sophistication that exceeded anything previously encountered in American criminal history. Dr. Gutierrez's examination of Margaret following her arrest revealed physical evidence that supported the psychological portrait emerging from her journal entries. She showed no signs of mental distress or emotional disturbance, despite being confronted with overwhelming evidence of her crimes. Her responses to questioning were calm and analytical, and she seemed more interested in discussing the intellectual challenges of her criminal activities than in defending herself against the charges. The interrogation of Margaret Hartford provided investigators with insights into the mind of America's first known female serial killer that would influence criminal psychology for generations to come. Margaret freely admitted to her crimes and provided detailed explanations of her methods, motivations, and future plans. Her willingness to discuss her activities seemed to stem from pride in her accomplishments rather than any desire for redemption or forgiveness. Margaret's explanation of her motivation revealed a complex mixture of greed, intellectual arrogance, and pathological need for control that defied simple categorization. She claimed that her crimes had been motivated initially by the need for financial security in a society that provided few opportunities for independent women, but had evolved into something resembling a personal war against what she viewed as the stupidity and gullibility of frontier society. The most disturbing aspect of Margaret's confession was her complete lack of remorse for her victims or their families. She described her husbands as weak men who had deserved their fate for being foolish enough to trust her, and she expressed contempt for the law enforcement agencies that had taken so long to apprehend her. Her attitude suggested that she viewed her eventual capture not as justice, but as a temporary setback in what she considered a legitimate intellectual competition. The legal proceedings that followed Margaret's arrest faced unprecedented challenges due to the multi-jurisdictional nature of her crimes and the primitive state of territorial law enforcement coordination. Prosecutors from Colorado, California, Nevada, and New Mexico all claimed jurisdiction over different aspects of her criminal activities, creating a complex legal situation that required intervention from federal authorities to resolve. The decision was made to try Margaret first in New Mexico for the attempted murder of the federal marshal, since that crime had been committed in federal jurisdiction and provided the strongest evidence for conviction. However, prosecutors planned to seek additional trials in other territories once the New Mexico case was resolved, ensuring that Margaret would face justice for all her known crimes. The trial preparations revealed that Margaret had been far more active during her time as a fugitive than even the extensive investigation had discovered. Bank records from various western cities showed evidence of financial transactions that suggested additional victims whose deaths had not yet been connected to her activities. The full scope of her criminal enterprise was still being uncovered as her trial date approached. Margaret's behavior during the legal proceedings continued to demonstrate the same cold calculation that had characterized her criminal activities. She showed no interest in mounting a traditional defense, but instead seemed to view the trial as an opportunity to demonstrate her intellectual superiority over the legal system. Her attitude suggested that she considered her eventual conviction and execution to be merely the final move in a complex game that she believed she had ultimately won by terrorizing the frontier for nearly 2 years without capture. The Margaret Hartford case had evolved from a local missing person investigation into a landmark criminal proceeding that would establish precedents for dealing with serial killers and multi-jurisdictional crimes. Her capture represented not just the end of a killing spree, but the beginning of a new era in American law enforcement that would require unprecedented cooperation between different agencies and territories to deal with criminals whose sophistication exceeded traditional investigative capabilities. The trial of Margaret Hartford began on March 15, 1861, in the territorial courthouse of Santa Fe, drawing spectators from across the Western territories who had traveled hundreds of miles to witness the proceedings against America's most notorious female criminal. Judge Harrison Wade presided over what would become the most sensational murder trial in frontier history, establishing legal precedents that would influence American jurisprudence for decades to come. Margaret's demeanor during the trial shocked observers who had expected to see a broken woman facing the consequences of her crimes. Instead, she appeared calm and composed, dressed in elegant black clothing that emphasized her refined appearance and made it difficult for spectators to reconcile her ladylike presentation with the horrific nature of her actions. She listened to testimony with apparent interest, occasionally taking notes and conferring with her court-appointed attorney as if she were observing someone else's trial. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming, presenting evidence from multiple territories that painted a picture of systematic murder spanning nearly 7 years. Witnesses testified about Margaret's marriages, her victims' mysterious illnesses, and the pattern of deaths that had followed her across the American frontier. Chemical evidence proved the presence of arsenic in her victims' remains, while her own journal provided detailed confessions to crimes that exceeded investigators' initial estimates. Dr. Gutierrez's testimony about Margaret's attempted murder at the Mission Hospital provided the most dramatic moment of the trial. His description of watching Margaret prepare poison for what she believed was a genuine patient demonstrated her complete lack of moral restraint and willingness to kill for minimal financial gain. The revelation that she had viewed her crimes as intellectual exercises rather than moral transgressions stunned even the hardened frontier audience. The defense strategy focused on Margaret's mental state, arguing that no rational person could commit such systematic atrocities without suffering from severe psychological abnormalities. Several physicians testified about the emerging understanding of criminal insanity, suggesting that Margaret's crimes were the product of mental disease rather than deliberate evil. However, Margaret herself undermined this defense by insisting that she was completely sane and had committed her crimes through careful planning and rational decision-making. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Judge Wade sentenced Margaret to death by hanging, making her the first woman in territorial history to receive capital punishment for multiple murders. The sentence was met with approval from spectators who had followed the case, though some observers questioned whether executing a woman, regardless of her crimes, was appropriate for a civilized society. Margaret's reaction to her death sentence was characteristically calm and analytical. She thanked the court for what she called a fair trial and expressed satisfaction that her crimes had finally received the attention she believed they deserved. Her final statement to the court included a warning that other criminals would study her methods and improve upon them, suggesting that her legacy would inspire future killers to develop even more sophisticated techniques. The months between Margaret's sentencing and execution were marked by unsuccessful appeals and growing public fascination with her case. Newspaper coverage transformed her from a regional criminal into a national celebrity, with articles about her crimes appearing in publications from coast to coast. The attention troubled many observers who worried that the publicity might encourage copycat criminals or inspire others to view murder as a path to notoriety. Margaret Hartford was executed on September 23, 1861, before a crowd of nearly 2,000 spectators who had gathered in Santa Fe's main square. Her final words were reported to be a statement that she regretted nothing except being caught, and that she hoped her example would inspire improvements in law enforcement techniques. She went to her death with the same composure that had characterized her criminal career, showing no fear or remorse as the sentence was carried out. The investigation into Margaret's crimes continued even after her execution, as authorities worked to identify additional victims and recover stolen property. Bank records and correspondence found in her various hideouts revealed evidence of at least 6 more murders that had not been included in her trial, bringing her total victim count to over 20 men across 5 territories. The scope of her criminal enterprise exceeded anything previously documented in American law enforcement history. The Margaret Hartford case fundamentally changed how law enforcement agencies approached serial crime and interterritorial cooperation. The challenges of tracking a sophisticated criminal across multiple jurisdictions led to the establishment of formal communication networks between territorial authorities and the development of standardized procedures for sharing evidence and coordinating investigations. These innovations would prove crucial as the American frontier continued to attract criminals seeking to exploit the weaknesses of isolated communities. The psychological aspects of Margaret's crimes attracted attention from alienists and early criminal psychologists who were beginning to study the motivations behind serial murder. Her case became a foundational example in the emerging field of criminal psychology, providing insights into the mind of a killer who combined extreme intelligence with complete absence of moral restraint. The clinical detachment she had shown toward her victims would become a recognized characteristic of psychopathic personalities. The communities that had been terrorized by Margaret's crimes slowly recovered from the trauma of discovering that they had harbored such a dangerous criminal. Pine Creek settlement eventually grew into a thriving mining town, though residents continued to speak in hushed tones about the woman who had murdered 7 husbands in their midst. The cabin where Margaret had lived was eventually torn down, but locals claimed that the site remained cursed and that strange occurrences continued to plague anyone who tried to build there. The financial impact of Margaret's crimes extended far beyond the direct theft of her victims' assets. Insurance companies throughout the Western Territories implemented new policies, requiring extensive background investigations before issuing life insurance policies to recently married couples. Banks developed more sophisticated procedures for verifying the identities of customers seeking to transfer large sums of money, and marriage brokers began requiring character references from multiple sources before arranging introductions between prospective spouses. Marshall Thompson, who had led the investigation that finally brought Margaret to justice, continued his law enforcement career until his retirement in 1875. He often spoke about the Hartford case as the most challenging and important investigation of his career, crediting it with teaching him the importance of interagency cooperation and systematic evidence analysis. His detailed records of the investigation became a training manual for future law enforcement officers dealing with complex criminal cases. The legend of Margaret Hartford persisted long after her execution, inspiring numerous books, newspaper articles, and even stage plays that dramatized her crimes for entertainment-hungry audiences. While most of these accounts took considerable liberties with the facts, they helped establish her place in American folklore as the frontier's most dangerous woman. Her story became a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking beneath the surface of seemingly respectable society. The legal precedents established during Margaret's trial influenced American jurisprudence for generations, particularly in areas involving serial crime, evidence preservation, and interjurisdictional cooperation. Her case demonstrated that the American justice system could adapt to deal with unprecedented criminal challenges, even when those challenges required fundamental changes in investigative techniques and legal procedures. The mystery of how Margaret Hartford had acquired her extensive knowledge of poisons, medicine, and criminal techniques was never fully solved. Some investigators theorized that she had received formal education under a false identity, while others suggested that she possessed a natural genius for criminal activity that had enabled her to develop sophisticated methods through experimentation and observation. The question of her background remained one of the case's enduring puzzles. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.